Muy buenos días a todos los presentes. Damos inicio al segundo día de las ponencias virtuales del primer Congreso Internacional Multidisciplinario de Investigación y Tecnología para el Conocimiento, organizado por la Universidad de Guayaquil. Agradecemos a todos nuestros ponentes por estar aquí presentes y compartir sus conocimientos con la comunidad educativa. Damos la bienvenida a nombre del doctor Francisco Morán Peña, rector de la Universidad de Guayaquil, a la doctora Sofía Lobato Torres, vicerrectora académica de la Universidad de Guayaquil, la decana de Investigación, Posgrado e Internacionalización, la doctora Luz Elvira Vázquez, y a la doctora Amalín Mayorga, coordinadora de Investigación y Gestión del Conocimiento. Según agenda programada para el día de hoy, empezamos con la ponencia virtual del doctor Graham Blue. El doctor es psicólogo académico con 25 años de experiencia en investigación y más de 11 años de experiencia en la docencia internacional. Posee un doctorado, un certificado de posgrado en educación, 2 títulos de licenciatura, uno en ciencias y otro en humanidades. Ha ocupado cargos académicos en universidades líderes en el Reino Unido, Japón, en Ecuador, en Kazajistán y Tailandia. Líder de investigación en Ecuador, es colegiado y miembro asociado de la Sociedad Británica de Psicología. Profesor visitante en la Universidad de Chulalongkorn en Bangkok, con su tema Neuropsychology of Socioeconomic Deprivation. Muy bienvenido, doctor.
Hola, muy buenos días.
Vamos a pasar, me parece, un video. Usted ya tiene su presentación, ¿verdad? Video.
Okay. ¿Para demostrar el video o no?
Javier, por favor, el video.
Hola, muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Graham Pluck y hoy voy a exponer sobre mis estudios en la Neuropsychología de la Deprivation Socioeconómica. Pero no hablo español muy bien, por eso voy a continuar en inglés. So there is a reason to link socioeconomic status to cognition. In fact, there are lots of reasons. Some of these are environmental factors. For example, socioeconomic status is linked to stress. It is linked to nutrition. It's linked to mental illness.
You can mute this now. I don't know.
Links to healthcare and access to healthcare. It's linked to educational access too, and also exposure to pollution and vulnerability to violence, amongst many other factors. And all of these can potentially influence the brain and cognitive ability. And of course, there are also genetic factors. About 50% of the variability in IQ scores is inherited. And IQ scores or cognition, to some extent, allow for socioeconomic mobility.
Right now,
on this, we can add that major mental illnesses have genetic components and cognitive impairment, and downward social mobility is associated with those illnesses. So we would expect some genetic influence on socioeconomic status, which would be linked to cognitive function. Now, that doesn't have to be a sort of a negative message, because we know that intelligence scores can improve quite dramatically. We know this, for example, from studies of adoption, and when children move from lower SES families into higher SES families through adoption, there is a large increase in their IQ scores in the range of about 12 to 18 points, which is a substantial increase. We also know that education is a powerful method of improving intelligence, and each year of formal education increases IQ by about 3.4 IQ points, and that seems to be a causal relationship. You can increase your IQ actually just by spending time in education. So cognitive ability seems to be quite plastic, and it can be altered by the situations we live in and our experiences, for example, in education. Now, just a little bit of background information before I talk about my own studies. And it's to do with the relationship between IQ and earnings. So this is data from the United States. This is the correlation between a person's income and their IQ scores. And you can see there is some sort of relationship there. People with the highest IQs tend to have a higher income, and people with the lower IQs tend to have a lower income. But it's not actually a strong relationship as people might think. For people who know statistics, the correlation is 0.3, which is a very sort of typical correlation in behavioral sciences. So it shows some relationship, but perhaps not as much as people would imagine. Interestingly, if we look at a person's wealth, the relationship is much less clear. So in this case, we just look at a person's net worth. This is how much money they have access to in relation to their IQ. The relationship is much smaller. There is still some relationship with people with high IQ tend to have a higher net worth, but now the correlation has dropped to 0.16. So the message here is you can inherit money without being smart. So the actual value or the amount of money you have isn't that related to intelligence. Now, we know from the neuroscience, there's lots of neuroscientific methods available these days to measure changes in brain structure and how they relate to sort of different lifestyle variables. So we can compare people with sort of higher or lower socioeconomic status or different experiences of psychological trauma, for example. And then we know that the two areas affected particularly by socioeconomic status the first one is the frontal lobe, and this is particularly involved with what we call executive functions. Now, executive functions mean abilities at a very high level and to do with, for example, switching between tasks, inhibiting your own behavior, and holding information and problem solving and planning. So these are the highest sort of levels of cognitive processing. And they're controlled by the frontal lobes. And we also know that socioeconomic deprivation is associated with changes in the temporal lobe. And again, the temporal lobe does lots of things, but it's particularly involved in language and memory processes. So we might expect there to be executive function differences and language and memory differences between richer and poorer children, for example. And this is exactly what people have found. This is research from the United States, and this was a group of 18 to 13-year-olds, and one group were from a quite low socioeconomic family groups, and one group were from a higher, richer socioeconomic groups. And this graph shows that the difference in cognitive scores for various abilities related to different parts of the brain. And the size of the bar indicates how different the poorer and the richer children performed. And you can see that the biggest effect sizes here the biggest one is for language. So the richer children did much better than the poorer children for language, with a large effect. The next highest was for memory ability. Okay, so the poorer children had worse memory ability than the richer children. And we also get effects related to what we call working memory. This is using short-term memory to solve problems and to manipulate information. And another one called cognitive control. And actually these are both examples of what I've called executive functions. These are the high-level cognitive abilities I mentioned earlier. Okay, so what research from children in the United States suggests this sort of mixture of language, executive function, and probably memory function related to socioeconomic deprivation. Now I'm going to talk next about some of the research I've been doing over the last few years in Ecuador. And the first study I'm going to mention here is a study of neuropsychological functions and socioeconomic status of a group of 132 college students in Ecuador. And this was data collected at UNACH in Riobamba and some of a smaller amount of data at Universidad de San Francisco in Quito. And what we did is we used 4 dichotomies of function in cognitive neuroscience, sort of well-known dichotomies. And the first one is, there's good reason to say that object recognition, visual spatial processing, use quite different parts of the brain in order to sort of carry out the necessary processes. So we measured these separately. We measured declarative memory. This is memory that you can declare, so it's things that you can consciously recall. And we compare that with procedural memory, which is memory of how to do things, like skills, things which you can't really describe how you do it, you just do it. We also used tests of language ability and spatial attention because there's sort of strong evidence that the same parts of the brain on the left hemisphere, which control language, control spatial attention on the right hemisphere of the brain. So that's third dichotomy. And the final one was what we call cool executive function. And these are the things I've mentioned before, like working memory and multitasking. And what we call hot executive function. And this is sort of decision making when there's risks or benefits involved, or sort of gambling and making money and things like that. So this gave us sort of 8 different basic neurocognitive processes to examine in relation to socioeconomic status. And what we did when we did this, we found, as probably as we would have expected, that language had the strongest effect. Language was quite strongly correlated, that's a strong effect there, with socioeconomic status. And this was the same that we showed earlier with the children from Martha Farrow's data. We also found strong, reasonable associations with memory ability, both declarative memory and procedural memory. They were all related to socioeconomic status. And this cool executive function. So this is more or less the same as was found in the United States with 8 to 13-year-olds, but we've shown it with a group of sort of young adults, actually university students. We got the same results. Now, the interesting thing that we did here is we removed the effect of language statistically from the data. And when you do that, you find the other effects all disappear. Now, this means that language ability is probably the underlying reasonless association between cognitive ability and socioeconomic status. When you remove the effects of language, all the other effects disappear. Now, our next study, we used a younger sample this time. These were aged 12 to 17, and this was 110 adolescents living in Quito. And they came from a large range of SES backgrounds. Some of the children were actually very poor, and some of them were sort of recruited from around University of San Francisco, were actually from quite rich backgrounds. And we examined their cool executive functions, and we examined their vocabulary as well as a measure of language. Now the tests, I'll show you some examples here. This is for a typical sort of executive function test. This is an Ecuadorian boy performing the tower test, and you have to move the discs and try and create a tower on a different peg, and there's strict rules about how to do this, and it's a sort of very complicated task to do. You have to plan ahead, and you have to inhibit yourself from making impulsive responses. So it is a difficult task. We also use this thing called design fluency, and in this task you have to draw a design and then draw a different design and then a different design again. You have to draw a different design each time. And so in order to do this, you have to sort of monitor your own behavior, and you have to make sure you're not repeating the same designs or getting into any sort of habit. So these are quite typical and good examples of what I've been calling executive function tests. We also studied something called theory of mind. Now, theory of mind It's been very popular over the last couple of decades in neuroscience and psychology because it helps explain some of the problems that many clinical patients have. A theory of mind is the ability to recognize mental states of other people. Okay, so one of the common tests, and the test that we used here, is called the Phopar Test. In Spanish, it's called Metidas de Pata. And essentially what happens is the participant reads this little story, and then they have to describe whether there was a faux pas or a metida de pata. So just I'll give you a second to read that. Yeah, so in this one there is the metida de pata, and we see whether the person can actually recognize that and explain why it was. And the other theory of mind test is called reading the mind in the eyes. And in this case, the person has to look at the picture of the eyes, and they have to identify the mental state of the person, and they have 4 choices to choose from. Okay, so this is another theory of mind test. Okay, now what we found is, we found a very large correlation of vocabulary with SAS in this Ecuadorian sample, and that correlation is 0.67, which is very large. You don't usually find such large associations in behavioral sciences. We also found a relationship with the Tower test, which is our executive function test, and we found association with the reading the mind in the eyes, which is this theory of mind test, and also the Phopar test. Okay. You see the values are a lot smaller than the vocabulary, so it seems that language seems to be the important factor. So the question is, will the executive function and theory of mind scores remain correlated with SES if vocabulary is covaried? And by this we mean if we remove the effect of language differences from the data, do the effects still exist? And the answer is no. All these effects disappear if we statistically covary language. And if you're not familiar with sort of covariance or regression, essentially all we've done is we've sort of removed the effect of language variation within the data set and seen if the other effects still remain, and they do not. Okay, now so far the research I've done really just sort of copies sort of things which were done in the United States, but of course in Ecuador and many other countries in South America, we have a sort of different situation than they do in the United States. And one of these is what we call the street children, or the street connected youth. This is a photograph I took in Quito. You can see the young girl waiting to sell products to motorists in Quito. And this is another one. This is outside Quito Centro in Quito. A common sight in Ecuador, isn't it? A young boy selling chicles to the motorists. Okay, so the next research focused on the theory of mind abilities of street-connected youth in Quito. Now, there are lots of reasons to suspect cognitive development might be a problem for street-connected youth. They live in a very sort of poor environment, and they're exposed to pollution and potentially to exploitation. They may not have access to education, for example. But in contrast, some studies have suggested street-connected youth might develop better skills compared to school-attending children. For example, street vendors in Brazil have better mathematics than children in school, and homeless children in Bolivia have better divergent thinking than children who have not been homeless from a similar background. So sometimes this homeless experience or experience of working in the streets actually helps cognitive development. We wanted to see whether that would translate into better theory of mind in Ecuadorian street children. So we used the same tests, these ones we showed you earlier, the Phopar test and the reading the mind in the eyes test, or sometimes called RMET. And we used this with 25 street-connected youth, and they were compared with 25 never street-connected youth. And this, technically, it is a match pair design, match for age, sex, and comprehension scores. So the two groups had exactly equal ability to understand verbal material. and they were also assessed for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Now, this is the main result here. The first result, street-connected youth have theory of mind problems. They did worse on both the reading the mind in the eyes test and the Phopar recognition test. So you can see the control, the orange bars, are much higher than the blue street-connected child bars. And you can see the verbal comprehension was identical between the groups. We can't explain it as a verbal comprehension. So this time language is not the explanation. It seems to be related to something else. Okay, so what could that be? Now we think this is to do with experiences of trauma, because we correlated the scores here and they were significantly correlated with PTSD severity scores, and the same for the Phopar scores. Now that's not quite significant, but we did have a small sample, only 25 participants. There's still a reasonable correlation there of 0.24. So I think this shows that in the street-connected youths, there is an additional impairment to do with theory of mind, and it's probably related to experiences of trauma. Now the last thing I want to talk about is moving back to adult studies, and this is homeless adults in Quito. And we conducted a study with 17 homeless adults and 16 education and age-matched controls. So this is quite a complicated, small sample, but quite a complicated study. We had to find 17 homeless people, and the homeless people in Quito tend to have quite low education levels, and then we needed to find a control group with the same low level of education. So both of these groups had about a total of 6 years experience in school. And they were tested with the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Examination. And briefly, that's just tests like this. The people are shown a picture, sort of this cookie theft picture, and they have to describe it, or they have to identify what an object is, like the periodontas. It's just basic sort of language functions. Okay, now it's partly obscured here, but you can see that we have an effect here for auditory comprehension and one for oral expression. So the homeless and control were matched for education level, and the homeless and controls were matched for pre-morbid ability. But they did have significantly worse on these measures of comprehension and expression. So this seems to show, again, we have mainly a language problem in these homeless adults. Okay, now so far all I've talked about is impairments associated with socioeconomic deprivation, street children and homeless adults, but it doesn't have to actually be so negative. There is lots of potential for improvement given education, for example. And the example I like to give is Dr. Mario Capecci. He was awarded the 2007 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, and he was a street child from the ages of 4 to 9. But obviously that didn't sort of keep him back. Okay, so my conclusions briefly now. Socioeconomic deprivation mainly affects language development. Other effects, for example, working memory or IQ, are probably related to language problems. But education is a powerful method to improve cognitive function. Psychological trauma may have separate effects. We saw that. And finally, most of the research described here was conducted without any research funds, just enthusiastic assistance. It's just the point that it is difficult to do research sometimes in Ecuador, but it's not impossible. You can get some nice results. And these are the research assistants. Thanks to all of these guys. These helped me do the research. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Hola, muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Graham Pluck y hoy voy a...
Bueno, hemos terminado con el video. En este momento pasamos a las preguntas y respuestas de la ponencia. Graham, at first I'm going to say it in Spanish, right? ¿Existe la posibilidad que la formación y desarrollo del aprendizaje en niños de escasos recursos mejore en algún punto de su crecimiento cuando influye un mejor entorno socioeconómico o esa situación es irreversible? Okay, so Graham, is there a possibility where for the development of children of low economic status, maybe in the future can improve if there is a different environment? It means a positive environment, or if it definitely is not possible?
No, there is lots of possibility for improvement and for development. I gave some evidence in the presentation, for example, when children are adopted from lower socioeconomic status families into more middle class families, usually their cognitive ability increases quite substantially. So yeah, there is quite a lot of potential.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Graham nos indica de que sí hay posibilidades de que los niños mejoren su parte de aprendizaje siempre y cuando estos niños tengan unas mejores posibilidades para la educación. En este caso, él puso un ejemplo en la investigación donde los niños cuando ya son adoptados o quizás pues regentados por una familia de mejores tipos socioeconómicos, pues el estudiante mejora, no solamente como aprendizaje en educación y conocimiento, sino sobre lo que él habla, que es la parte emocional. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Thank you very much, Graham, for your participation.
Okay. Gracias.